Welcome. You've heard before there's good news and there's bad news. Well, tonight there's good news and there's better news. The good news is that my voice is almost gone. So you don't have to listen to me much. The even better news is that we have Dr. Sarah Whipple here from next door at BMI to talk to us about her specialty, which is stress and its relation to brains, behavior, and bodies, and bones, and poverty. These people. And Dr. Whipple actually taught a course on this subject, the effects of poverty on children and families several years ago. So I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Sarah Whipple.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Pickett. I always love to come next door and see how the other half lives. So I'll introduce you guys to our topic today. I am a developmental psychologist by training, and my research background is in the effects of poverty on children's developmental outcomes, particularly educational achievement and attainment, so how poverty affects how you do in the classroom, basically. So the plan for today, I want to just kind of introduce you to the numbers. We're going to focus on children today. I don't do a lot of work with adults in poverty. My focus, again, has to do with young children. So I'll give you some of the basic numbers. We're going to talk about the connection between poverty and stress. I imagine most of you can picture how those two things are related, but we'll tease it apart a little bit. And then get into this concept of allostatic load, and specifically how stress impacts the brain and our behaviors. So hopefully by the end of this, you guys will know everything and you'll be able to recite it yourselves. Before we really jump into the nitty-gritty, we have to talk about what poverty is. So you guys are POV 101 students, most of you. Have you talked at all? Does anybody know the threshold for a 4-person family, 2 adults, 2 children? What is the poverty line? Anybody happen to know or guess?
Like 12,000?
12,000? Thankfully, it's higher than that. That's about for 1 person, 1 adult.
So like 22,000?
Close, 24,000. About $24,000 is our federal poverty line for a family of 4. $24,000. I don't know, most of you are not paying rent at this point, but most people that pay rent would say, wow, that's ridiculous, right? I couldn't even pay rent based on that amount of money. So with that definition, 1 in 5 American kids is living below the poverty line. 1 in 5, so more than 20%. And the numbers are actually higher for our youngest kids. So this is a graphic from the National Center for Children in Poverty. And what we find is here are the kids living below the poverty line, 0 to 6. Now we're looking at almost 1 in 4 for really young kids. The near poor are people living at 200% the poverty line, so this would be $24,000 times 2 for a family of 4. So a family of 4 at $48,000, which is still struggling pretty substantially. Those numbers surprise you at all? I hope so. It's fairly troubling. This kind of breaks it down just to show you furthermore that the kids that are real young are the ones that are disproportionately in poverty. Tend to also be with single parent households, but typically headed by the mother. So you see as we get into adulthood, we still certainly have 14% of people in poverty, but children are disproportionately represented in poverty. So we care about this, the fact that 0 to 6-year-olds are the ones that are, almost 1 in 4 living in poverty, because early childhood is so crucial to brain development. I'm going to start you off down here, a little graphic. This is synapses forming in the brain. Synapses are the connections between neurons. So every time you learn something new, a synapse forms, two neurons connect. You might remember it's a little space in between neurons. Every time you reinforce that new concept, you study it, right? Then the synapse there gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So what do you notice up until 2 years? What's happening with synaptic growth? It's increasing substantially, right? It's skyrocketing. Newborns have a few synaptic connections, but look at 6 months, right? The difference between 3 months and 6 months. This is because babies come into the world waiting to suck up everything from the environment. They want to learn. They're waiting for the environment to teach them what they need to know. What about 4 years and 6 years? Does it look like it's still going up, or is it cutting back now? It's cutting back, right? So this is actually the period of pruning. Maybe some of you studied this before. This is where neuronal connections, the brain is trying to become more efficient in early childhood. So we build up all those experiences, try and take in everything we need from the environment, and then we kind of start to specialize. Our brain realizes we don't need all of these connections, and in order for it to run the most efficiently as possible, it actually starts to cut things back. But all of this is happening based on environmental input. So I don't know if any of you have tried to learn a second language, but it's far easier when you are younger. This is an example of the brain being plastic, the brain being very moldable and forgiving when we're really young. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold and my voice is a little shaky. So it's much easier, because our brain is plastic and flexible, to learn language. In fact, when you were born, you could have learned any language in the entire world. It just so happens most of you learned English because that's what you were exposed to in the environment, right? That's what the environment taught you. You could have just as easily learned Japanese, Afghani, if only you were exposed. And then as you got older, you didn't need any of those connections that might have progressed you in some of these other languages. Other evidence for this plasticity, people that do not have one sense. So for example, if you're born blind, the brain naturally, it's plastic, it's moldable, it reorganizes. So instead of the occipital lobe, which is typically used for vision, occipital lobe's in the back of your head, it will reorganize and start to devote that part of your brain to other senses. So that people that are born blind tend to have more acute sense of touch, sense of hearing. The brain does not waste space. So this is the good news. We're plastic, we're really moldable. We can, if we have really positive environments, we can do incredible things. Right, so you can probably imagine the flip side. We're plastic, we're moldable, we're waiting for the environment to kind of teach us, to learn. But if the environment is stressful or dangerous or scary, if you're not getting the stimulation that you need, then our brain actually reacts to that as well. So just to show you how early all of this starts to happen, I'm going to show you a very quick clip of one of my favorite neuroscientists, a guy by the name of Robert Sapolsky, talking about prenatal development and how the body and the brain are actually learning, even before we're born, in utero, about what to expect of our environment, how we can adapt. Hopefully the volume is good here. I think. Yeah, this was way down. I got it.
Development is shaped by the psychological and social environment. So the biology of human beings is very much affected by and programmed by their life experiences beginning in utero.
Environment does not begin at birth. Environment begins as soon as you have an environment. As soon as you are a fetus, you are subject to whatever information is coming through mom's circulations, hormones, levels of nutrients. Great landmark example of this, something called the Dutch hunger winter. 1944, Nazis occupying Holland. For a bunch of reasons, they decide to take all the food and divert it to Germany. For 3 months, everybody there is starving. Tens of thousands of people starve to death. What the Dutch hunger winter effect is, if you were a second or third trimester fetus during the starvation, your body learned something very unique during that time. Because it turns out second, third trimester, something that your body is going about trying to learn about the environment is, well, how medicine place is it out there, how plentiful, how much nutrients am I getting by way of mom's circulation. Be a fetus who was starving during that time, and your body programs forever after to be really stingy with your sugar and fat, and what you do is you store every bit of it. Be a Dutch hunger winter fetus, and half a century later, everything else being equal, you are more likely to have high blood pressure, obesity, or metabolic syndrome. That is environment coming in a very unexpected place.
You can stress animals.
So I just think that is an incredible study. That was possible because the Netherlands keeps really meticulous records of the people in their country, and so they could actually trace back and see which women were pregnant based on birth records, etc. So essentially, right, the fetus is learning from the environment about what to expect when it's born. And if it's not given much food, then it learns, I gotta hold on to every single calorie, every single gram of fat, right? Because I need this. The environment is sparse. So the body actually programs itself in utero to slow down metabolism. This is the environment shaping our development. And then once they're born, a few years later, right, we've got Burger Kings, we've got McDonald's, we've got fast food, food aplenty. So now we don't have the same issue, but the body is still pre-programmed to hold on to all those calories. So these individuals have higher levels of obesity, higher levels of diabetes, hypertension, because of what happened in utero. I should say, if you guys have questions, feel free to interrupt if it's something that has to do with what we're talking about now. I'll also leave some time at the end, but if it fits in right now, then absolutely raise your hand. So the environment matters. And clearly, we all know that income, all money is, all poverty is the lack of money. Right? So we need to start figuring out, like, teasing apart what is it about the lack of money that is having all of these adverse outcomes on children. We tend to see kids with lower levels of academic achievement, lower levels of educational attainment, so meaning they don't go to college at the same rates or graduate high school. More behavior problems, more mental health problems. So I want you guys to brainstorm here and think about what things do money and or education buy children?
Opportunities.
Like what? What types of opportunities? Yeah.
Tutors, books.
Tutors, books, right. More books in the home. And then if you need help, mom and dad can afford to get you a tutor. What other types of stuff?
Private education versus the public one.
Okay, private education.
Social activities and sports.
Absolutely, social activities, right? Those things oftentimes are not cheap. Anything else?
Therapy.
Therapy, yes, true. And that, I laugh, but you're absolutely right. Therapy and things like access to medical services in general, right? An even bigger issue here. So therapy, and within that, access to overall medical services. Anything else?
Housing,
Housing. What do you mean?
like just that if your parents have more money, you're more likely to grow up in a like safe and clean environment.
Yeah, so not just have a house, right? Just because you're poor doesn't mean you are homeless, by the way. Poor people are not all homeless. So it's that you have a safe house, a house that doesn't have a leaky roof, a house where you're not scared because you have to leave the pilot light on the stove for heat. Right? You're not scared for your safety. Any other things? Yeah.
Better quality food.
Better quality food, great point. You could get the dollar menu, the value meal at McDonald's, nice and, cost effective, right? But I think we all know that that is not the most nutritious choice. Nutritious food costs more money. So some of, this is one of my favorite models of development. This is called Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model of development. And I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's just a nice way to think about kind of the risk factors that children face. So you can think of it as here's the child in the middle, and the child comes into the world with all these genetic predispositions. Some kids tend to be more outgoing than others, some tend to be more shy. But then the child interacts with the world around him or her. So they have their home environment. Okay? Whatever advantages or disadvantages might be in the home. Okay? Do they have a single parent home? Does mom work a lot? Siblings, etc. They interact with a peer group. When they're young, they're in daycare, school, etc. And all of those different environments might have their own advantages or disadvantages. Right? Low-income schools tend to have less qualified teachers, for example. And then we can trace it around. You get to this outer layer is getting into social policy. So the idea that even though kids, the child is in here, so policy is very far removed from the kid, but nevertheless, policies trickle down to affect children. So things like, I know we've got some psychology students in here, things like how the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, how it defines certain disorders is going to impact whether these kids qualify for special services. So all of that goes back to the kid. There's a lot of research for many, many years. We've been collecting some of the correlates of poverty. So these are some of what we call the psychosocial relationships that we find. So children that come from poverty are more likely, this is not that every kid in poverty, right, has a single parent family by any means, but they're at increased risk. They're more likely to have a family that is separated, divorced, a father, mother might be incarcerated, violence, unresponsive, harsh parenting. We tend to see more kind of authoritarian parenting styles in low-income homes. Cognitive stimulation, higher income homes tend to just use more language, tend to speak more to their children. There's more language being used, and we find that language is really key to not only language development, but social and emotional development and understanding, right? If you are taught what the word frustrated means, and now you have a label for your feelings, and you can express yourself, maybe you don't have to act out and misbehave. Less social support, so social support being, friendships, people that you can talk to and rely on, somebody that'll give you a ride to the airport. Neighborhood issues, okay? Greater exposure to neighborhood crime. Physically, there are also effects within the physical environment. So if you've heard the term the other side of the tracks, it is quite literal. Oftentimes when they put in airports or railroad tracks or something, they put them to separate the low-income neighborhood from the more affluent neighborhood. Right? It was the other side of the tracks. And typically they invaded the low-income neighborhood because they had less power. Right? They couldn't do anything about it. Within the home and the neighborhood, more noise. Right? Decibel levels have been recorded in low-income neighborhoods, low-income houses. The housing issues that we talked about, books that we mentioned, and neighborhoods. So low-income neighborhoods are more likely to have fast food restaurants and liquor stores. True fact, true fact. That's so redundant, sorry. So I'm kind of building this model, right? It's not just poverty that leads to negative outcomes. There's some stuff in the middle there, right? Because all poverty is the lack of money, and money is just paper. What's the big deal, right? But money buys you certain experiences. It buys you the ability to, read books to your child, take them to plays, take them to the science center. And it reduces, certainly more affluent parents have stress and more affluent children have stress, but not to the same degree generally. Right? So poverty is associated with higher levels of stress, lower levels of stimulation. Not only is there higher levels of stress, but we see as poverty goes up, what happens is the number of stressors or the number of risk factors that kids are exposed to. So all of those things back here, for example, these and these are the risk factors, we'll say. The blue lines here are middle income children. And these are the number of stressors they're exposed to. You want to have a low number of stressors in your life. And you can see that most middle-income kids have one, But children from poverty have 2, 3, 4, 5, some of them having 6 of these stressors. These are, by the way, just so you know the sample, these are 8 to 10-year-old children from a rural area in upstate New York. This is where that data comes from. So I don't think it's very likely that a lion is going to come in here and attack us, but let's imagine, there's a lion roaring at us from outside. What types of things do you think would happen to your body if all of a sudden you realized there was a lion nearby?
Adrenaline.
What's that?
Adrenaline.
Adrenaline, yes, your body's going to reduce use. It's going to express adrenaline. Fear, okay. You're going to get scared. Heart rate goes up. What else? What?
Start breathing fast.
Start breathing fast.
Pupil dilate.
Yeah, pupils are going to dilate, right? Because you want to let in more light. You need to see what's going on around you. So this is what our ancestors, this was the stress that they used to deal with, right? They lived outdoors and were concerned about lions and bears and things that could attack them and other tribes, right? But what would happen with them, so they had this stress response where, if you look over here, here's all the sympathetic nervous system is what deals with our stress response, and these are some of the things that happen. So your pupils are going to dilate to let in light so that you can see and react appropriately to this lion. Your body is going to focus on the most important processes. You only have so much energy. And so, for example, you're not going to, does it have on here? No, I don't see it. You're not going to worry about reproduction if you're being chased by a lion. So women are not going to ovulate. Okay, your body's going to kind of say, let's not worry about that right now. You might also literally pee your pants because it's not important, right, to hold your bladder when you're being chased by a lion. So there's all of these effects because of our sympathetic nervous system, and this gets activated during the stress response. This is all well and good if you're being chased by a lion, right? Because eventually you either manage to escape or you get eaten, right? And then, okay, the stress response goes back down. Your parasympathetic nervous system, which is your calming sense, this is kind of the opposite of everything over here. This is the calm response, is going to kick in and your body kind of de-escalates. But in modern times, we don't get chased by a lion. We have more of these, what we call chronic stressors. Poverty is one of the largest chronic stressors. You're constantly worried about paying the bills, the lights getting turned off, my kid's sick, but I can't afford to take him to the hospital, I can't take any more time off of work, etc., etc. Constant worries. So the stress response in and of itself is not bad, right? Stress is actually beneficial to us. There's positive stress. It builds character. But when you are stressed daily, in and out, right, and then your body has a hard time shutting down, this is when we have problems. So we call that chronic stress as opposed to acute stress. Acute stress is something short term, it's going to go away. You have a test tomorrow, so you're stressed, but then the test is over and you can relax a little bit. The research on stress is finding, in particular, that as chronic stress builds up, what happens is there's this cumulative kind of wear and tear on the body. So as part of the stress response, right, the body constantly mobilizes itself. The heart rate goes up, right? We've got to prepare ourselves. Adrenaline gets released. Cortisol in our brain gets released. So the body pumps itself up, and it does this every time. What happens with chronic stress is it's in this heightened state of arousal. In the body, after a while, it can't actually bring itself back down to the normal resting state. This is what we call allostatic load, right? That because you've accumulated all of this stress, eventually, have you guys ever been just so tired, right, or so hyped up with coffee that you just can't bring yourself back down, you can't relax? It's not exactly the same, but the best parallel that I can try to draw here. So what happens in allostatic load is when this occurs, the body's in this hyper-aroused state. It starts to affect our dendrites in our brain, neurons. Okay? We tend to see that neurons are no longer regenerating. Neurotransmitters are affected. Things like dopamine and serotonin, things that are neurotransmitters that affect our mood and our ability to learn new things. So I'm continuing to build and build and build this model, right? Poverty leads to an assortment of risk factors. The more risk factors you're exposed to, the more stress that you experience. Stress increases the likelihood that you are going to experience allostatic load, which is a physical effect on your body. Your body actually being hyper-aroused, too much cortisol being produced. And so our body gets overwhelmed, it gets tapped out. You with me so far? Yeah? So let's take a look at the brain. What happens? I'm going to focus, most of the research tends to find that there's 4 main brain areas where we tend to see differences across impoverished and middle income children. So I've represented them as best I can here. The amygdala. Does anybody happen to know what the amygdala does? Yeah. Very good. Fear, emotional understanding. We'll talk about the hippocampus. Anybody know offhand what that is responsible for? Memory. Good. Prefrontal cortex. Decision making, among other things. What else?
High-level cognitive processes.
High-level cognitive processes. You kind of think the prefrontal cortex is really what separates us from a lot of other animals, right? A lot of higher-level thinking that goes on in the prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortexes, most of them have not yet fully formed. This is the last part of your brain to finish forming, developing. So typically around approximately age 22 to 25 is when you see it reach its full development, which is why some people suggest that teenagers tend to be impulsive and have a difficult time thinking ahead, weighing different options, because all of this deals with the prefrontal cortex. Temporal lobe has to do with language, among other things. Some work in the early 2000s started to look at, granted this is a little bit different. Does anybody know what the difference is between poverty and SES? Sometimes these people use these terms interchangeably, but they really are not interchangeable. Any guesses? What is poverty about? What is the essence of poverty? What are we measuring?
Socioeconomic status.
Poverty is socioeconomic status? Low income, right? So poverty has to do with money. What do you think socioeconomic status has to do with? Class. So it's money, it's still money, but it's kind of subjective status in society too. So your occupational prestige is considered here, and your level of education, right? So SES is a little bit broader. It's money, education, and occupational prestige. So I'm kind of diverging a little, I admit, by now talking about SES, still related. So some work by Martha Farah found that low SES kids, they looked at a number of different brain areas, but they found that the brain areas that tend to take the longest to develop are the ones that are most affected by poverty. And the longer you are in poverty, the more likely we're going to see adverse consequences. So in particular, language areas of the brain, the prefrontal area, right behind your forehead, the part of your brain that is still developing, prefrontal cortex, and the temporal working memory system. Don't worry so much about the data points on here, but I just want to point out that work is finding this was work done by Gary Evans up at Cornell with rural children living in poverty. So he looked at the proportion of their life in childhood that they spent in poverty, right? And he used that to see if he could predict how they would perform on, do you guys know the Simon game? Where it has 4 different colors and you have to repeat the pattern. So this is a working memory task. Working memory is when you have to hold certain information in your head, in your memory, and then kind of learn something new and pay attention to what's going on and then pull out that information. So with Simon, you have to remember the old pattern, but then pay attention to the new stuff that's going on. So we looked at how many patterns of Simon that these children could get. And he found decrements in working memory. Basically, as the proportion of your life in poverty went up, your working memory ability went down. And other research has found that this is largely because of, explained by allostatic load. Working memory is crucial for doing well in school. Crucial for academic achievement. You need to process, hold on to old information, process new information. That's what academics is all about. So living in poverty undermines this pretty important skill. Some of the other findings, most of this comes from the two researchers up there and their colleagues, Luby and Pollak. Poverty during early childhood, when the environment is particularly crucial, right? We're waiting for experiences to teach us about what our world is like. What we find is less gray matter in all these different brain areas that we mentioned, the hippocampus, the temporal lobe, the prefrontal cortex, and this is related to intelligence. Gray matter has to do with cognitive skill. And these were decrements of, nearly 10% less gray matter for kids that were growing up in poverty. Less white matter. White matter has to do with, if you remember from biology, has to do with myelin, some fatty substance that wraps around neurons and helps them conduct their signals at a faster pace. So we see less white matter. We see literally smaller brain volumes. Children growing up in poverty tend to have smaller hippocampi, smaller parts of the brain that process long-term memory. And one of the reasons for this is that stress hormone, cortisol, that is released during the fight or flight response tends to affect and kill off neurons in our hippocampus. We also see smaller amygdalae, and I'm going to talk about that shortly. I'm going to jump ahead to amygdalae. There's been some really interesting research on the amygdala and how stress can affect this part of our brain. So just to reiterate, amygdala processes fear in the environment and emotional understanding. It has to do with emotions. So we actually tend to find, similar to the hippocampus, that children growing up in poverty have smaller amygdalae. Amygdala is one. We have two, one on each side, one in each hemisphere of our brain. That's why the spelling changes. So they have smaller volumes. Research, interestingly, this has nothing to do with poverty, but research has found that people exposed to the World Trade Center bombing back in 2001 have stronger amygdala activation to fearful faces, right? So, and similar types of things happen to people with PTSD. So the environment, having been around this terrifying situation, has now changed, literally changed the brain, changed the amygdala. People that have experienced some kind of traumatic event and have now are dealing with PTSD, and people that were exposed to World Trade Center bombings actually now react more intensely to fearful faces than their counterparts. So the brain changes. It realizes, okay, this is a scary environment. I need to be on guard, right? The amygdala starts to jump up and think, okay, this, I need to protect myself. So sometimes I go through all of this, and then inevitably some of the questions are, well, what do we do, right? If we know all of this, that there's impacts of the environment on children's development, if there's impacts of poverty, what do we do about it? So the first one is obvious. It's easy to say. It's not very easy to do, but as much as possible, we try to minimize children's adverse experiences. We try to minimize the amount of stress that they're exposed to. Again, easy to say. Realistically, sometimes this is not easy to do. Kind of along those same lines, though, programs have found to be effective that provide support and training to parents. Okay? Teaching parents, just like you guys are learning, the brain is a muscle, right? That experience can shape it, can influence it. So teaching parents about this. Interestingly, one of those findings, the fact that poverty decreased hippocampus size, it wasn't just poverty. Remember, we always talk about something in between. Children from low-income families tended to experience more hostility, a less kind of warm parenting. And that's what actually tends to explain the hippocampal changes. So it's not the poverty itself, but it's what poverty tends to be associated with, right? If mom and dad are really stressed out about money, they might not be as patient with you. They might react more with more hostility. So if we can train parents about the importance of them being good parents, right, then this can be beneficial. I shouldn't say good parents, that is a value statement of them being more supportive parents. And there's some research that you can do basic, simple cognitive interventions with kids. You can do training programs that increase the likelihood that they're going to pay attention and actually improve. Again, the brain is like a muscle. You teach these kids exercises to improve their attention, to improve their memory, and it's beneficial. They actually can be brought back up to where their peers are, which is kind of amazing, because we now understand that people aren't just born this way. The environment is actually affecting their brain and their development. So we can also affect them positively. We can have interventions that can improve life. I'm going to end with a little bit on the Romanian orphanages, just because I find that most people find this pretty fascinating, and the research here really does get to the impact of early environment. Do any of you know the history of Romania? You guys might. Does anybody know who Ceausescu was? Nicolae Ceausescu? No? Yeah.
It's like I think communist dictators have control of Romania. I think like through the 90s.
Yep, he got overthrown in 1989, so pretty close, right? He got into power about 1965 and was overthrown in 89. Something else?
Did he make abortion illegal before his baby?
He did. So he had this grand scheme that he was going to improve Romania's economic status in the world by increasing its population, right? All we need is more able working bodies. So he gave financial incentives for the more children that you had. There were penalties if you did not have enough children. And not thinking so much about the consequences and the fact that people could not afford these children, what ended up happening is a lot of kids were sent to orphanages. The parents just couldn't take care of them. So this is going back to that big circular model, Bronfenbrenner's model, right? Macro system, policy, the government is now impacting the individual's development. So this dictator says this is how it's going to be, and now we have all of these abandoned children growing up in orphanages. There was some research that was done. They could actually do an experiment, and what these researchers did with about, I think it was about 160 of these kids, was they randomly assigned half of them to stay in institutional care, and the other half to be adopted by a foster family in Romania. So some people think it sounds really harsh. These kids would have stayed in institutional care had they not, had the experiment not happened. So it's not like they held them back from some opportunity. And what they found was, randomly assigned to these two conditions, IQ, this is the impact of environment. These were sparse orphanages. They were understaffed. Kids did not get nearly enough attention, enough cognitive stimulation. And you see the differences. So these are the kids that were left in the orphanages. IQ, if you don't know, the average IQ is 100. So both were stunted, okay? But clearly the kids in institutional care are 10 points lower than the kids that were adopted. Psychiatric diagnoses, this should be 20%, sorry about that. 53% for those that remain in the orphanage versus 20% that had some kind of psychiatric diagnosis at age 4.5. And then similar to some of the other findings, brain and white matter were impacted. So those in the orphanages had less volume, muted brain activity. So if you think of, your brain functioning on a 100-watt light bulb, that being the average, these kids were about a 40-watt light bulb. That it just was not processing at the same pace. The activity was not as intense. So what I suggest here is the environment matters. The environment matters. Poverty is just money, but what that does to you, or the lack thereof, right, is increase stress. You're exposed to a number of risk factors. This increases stress, increases allostatic load, which is the physical effect on your body. When that happens, our brain literally changes. Neurons die. Neurotransmitters get messed up. And then we see all of the behavioral and health outcomes that you hear about, changes in academic achievement, for example, mental health diagnoses. So I just want to leave you with a quote. This was interesting. I just recently came across this. We often think of poverty as a social problem, but research nowadays is telling us it's more than that. It's biomedical. We can intervene. We know that there are interventions that can actually help children in poverty. Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
When you said one of the fixes that could be done is just to eliminate these negative stressors. I'm wondering if, because I feel like, and maybe this is not really based in a lot of psychological facts, but I feel like there are people who have stressors young, and maybe it's just not enough stress, but they end up still being successful. And I'm wondering if there's value in kind of studying maybe across socioeconomic status, looking at people who had stress when they were young, and then what kind of things can be done, what kind of things compensated the stress and they were still successful. So maybe a way to look at what other factors can maybe counteract stress.
Yeah, that's great. It sounds like you're talking about resilience research, that despite being, some kids, despite being exposed to a bunch of risk factors, will turn out pretty well. Will, be exceptions and will, do phenomenally. And there's some research that finds, first of all, social support is one of the biggest resilience factors. So even if you're growing up in a difficult household, if you have, a coach or a mentor or an aunt or someone that you can constantly rely on, then that is huge. So social support is one of the biggest ones. There also seem to be genetic differences, that some people genetically seem to have more tolerance to stress and tend to be more resilient. So there is definitely research into that. You're right on. Anything else?
So, I know there's a lot out there about like how fetuses respond to like more biological things, like if the mother it doesn't have good nutrition during pregnancy. But is there much on like whether like if more psychological stress, whether like, if the mother's just under stress,
Yes.
like because of problems at work, if that has a negative effect on like the outcomes of
Yeah.
child?
Yeah, so yes, maternal stress during the last trimester in pregnancy has been studied, and it actually does have an effect on the developing fetus's brain. So it happens young. Same thing with, I think there was some work looking at anxiety as well, along those same lines, prenatal anxiety in mothers. Anything else?
So I sometimes, you can communicate this to them.
Yeah.
I sometimes hear people say, well, I understand that low-income households may face a lot of stress, but so do extremely high-income households. How would you explain the difference between, or is there a difference between the stress that low-income kid may be facing versus a really overworked CEO? Correct, because we tell a story that that's a very stressful job. It is in a certain sense, but are those different meanings of the word stress?
I don't think it's necessarily a different meaning of the word stress, but I think the accumulation of stressors is what's important. So the low-income kid, the high-income kid, let's say, whose father, he's got a lot of money, but dad tends to be emotionally unavailable, physically unavailable, right? So that is certainly, that can be a stressor. But typically, right, that kid goes to probably a better school where might find social support and some of these resilience factors that can help compensate, right? Whereas low-income kids, their environments across the board tend to be less supportive, right? They're living in neighborhoods that are potentially dangerous. They're going to a school where the teachers are not as qualified. Home might not feel safe. So the accumulation is what I would say really matters. And it's not so much the degree of one risk factor, so dad not being available, as the number of risk factors you have across the board. That tends to be what matters.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all. I'm not turning it off.
Thank you, sir. Do you know much about the so-called Whitehall study?
Yeah.
So, like one explanation.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, most of them had to get back. That's fine.
So as I understand it, one hypothesis is that the social gradient is there due to the fact that my relative status is stressful. Is that right?
It's been a while since I've looked at. Whitehall had to do with educational achievement too,
No,
right?
it was mainly for workers in different socioeconomic status jobs.
Yes.
And even when they had access to the same health care, and a variety of other things, you still saw the social gradient.
Well, and what's interesting is they find that growing up in poverty, even if you raised yourself out, if you grew up in poverty, you still have the physical effects of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so sounds similar. I don't.
Gotcha. Well, I'll find
Thank
it and
you.
see if I can pull
You're
up the
welcome.
question. Good to see you, Jay. All right, let me make sure I don't screw this up. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Let me see. Stop. Oh,